Welcome to Grumpy Strategists, episode 17. I'm Michael Shoebridge and I'm with SAA's Head of Research, Dr. Marcus Hellyer. Marcus, how's the world look?
The world is good, and I'd just like to welcome you back. Our devoted listeners may have realised that there's been a bit of a gap in podcasts. That's because you've been on a cricket tour of India, and you're now back. I understand you had a very good time.
Yes, indeed. So I was in Punjab, where my son played in a cricket tournament, and then in Delhi. And my main purpose was to expand SAA's reach as a global think tank. So I was in India, but Leslie Seebeck has been in Europe, in fact in Zagreb. You're back from Washington, D.C. So we now have a European, North American and subcontinental focus, as well as, of course, a focus on our immediate region, like the Australian government's new National Defence Strategy. And that strategy and the money plan that came out at the same time.
You missed the launch, Michael. But
I was in
You're
India
always a little
with
behind the curve, but you've managed to catch up.
Luckily, you were here working slavishly.
Somebody had to do some work, Michael.
So this new National Defence Strategy, I mean, we were waiting eagerly for it from the time that the Defence Strategic Review came out, because we were told the surface combatant review was going to happen. It came out. But the big thing was this new fundamental approach to defence strategy, because it was going to be holistic and national for the first time. What do you make of that claim? How much of the broadening is there in this thing?
Well, I guess our listeners will not be all that surprised to learn that I think we are both somewhat underwhelmed. Again, to quote The Princess Bride, the mantra there, get used to disappointment. I think we've gotten used to disappointment. So first up, National Defence Strategy. There is no national in here. There's a reference to whole of nation, whole of government. There is no national here. It is a good old-fashioned mini defence white paper. So there is nothing in here beyond defence itself. So First up, it doesn't answer the mail on that issue. Now, okay, it's only been 1 year. 1 year since the DSR, so I don't know if you can reasonably expect this full-on nationalification of our defence strategy, but there is absolutely nothing there at this point. Will future editions, the next one in 2 years' time, do better there? Perhaps, I don't know.
I don't think so. I think it is an empty vessel on this national element. What it really does is just encourage closer partnerships and working relationships. It talks about closer partnerships between the federal and state and territory governments, closer partnerships between government and industry.
Yes, but what
more
form those
resilience
partnerships
out of that
take is...
Well, there's nothing there.
There's
nothing there. And so you get all this stuff about national holistic integrification up the front end, but there's no meat in the rest of the document.
No, it's a good old-fashioned, I would say, abridged defence white paper. Again, there's lots of talk about this being completely new, completely different. What do you think is new and different in here, Michael?
I actually think the numbers in the strategy. So later on, we're going to talk about the numbers in the investment plan, but I think the numbers in this defence strategy tell you a story about how effective it's going to be. Because think about what Richard Marles and the defence leadership have been saying for the last 2 years. It's very important to focus. It's very important to prioritise. You need clarity. So let me give you the clarity through the numbers. Now, this may take some time, but remember, at the end of it...
Numbers are objective, Michael. So if there's lots of numbers, presumably this is very precise and objective.
Well, if you don't have clarity, you can't focus. So I'll just take you through a set of numbers. You will have to be patient. In 71 pages, these to me are the key numbers. Australia has 3 strategic objectives for defence now: shape, deter and respond.
So correct me if I'm wrong, those were the 3 in the Defence Strategic Update 4 years ago.
That's correct.
So they're not new and different.
But the difference is that the second one, deter, is now the priority. So shaping and responding are still important, but out of these 3 strategic defence objectives, deter is now the priority. See what clarification that gives you?
Sir, but correct me if I'm wrong. Deterrence relies on the ability to respond. You need to be able to convince your adversary that you have credible response options that you are willing to employ. So how can deter be actually different or more important than respond?
Well,
because if you can't respond, you can't deter.
But you could say the same thing about shaping. If you're not shaping your environment through your partnerships and alliances, then you can't deter. And in fact, the document spends a whole lot of time talking about shaping through the partnerships. Anyway, so there are 3 strategic defence objectives. There are 5 tasks.
5 tasks?
5 tasks for defence to pursue these 3 objectives. So 3 objectives, 5 tasks.
Yep. What are the 5 tasks, Michael?
They're defence of Australia and its immediate region.
No, that's not very new and different.
Deterring in our northern approaches.
Northern approach, not very new and different.
Protecting Australia's economic connections to the world.
Those go quite a long way.
Yes.
I mean, the world is quite large.
It doesn't include operating off the Red Sea to stop the Houthis damaging global trade.
Okay.
Contributing to collective partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, collective defence.
All right, so Indo-Pacific quite big, but not new and different.
And the last one of the 5, contributing to partners' maintenance of the rules-based global order.
Global. So when you take all 5 of them, if I can paraphrase, we still need to do everything conceivably everywhere in the world.
But the clarity of the 5 tasks, ranging from immediate defence to global rules-based order. I think that...
Could you say that this is a bit like concentric circles that we may have had in white papers of all time past?
You could say that, but I'd say the distinction here is there are more concentric circles, you see, and that brings the clarity.
So we want the ADF to do more, apparently.
Well, the wider set of tasks,
different tasks.
But in a very focused way. Because don't forget, there are 3 objectives, one of which is more important than the others, and there are 5 tasks.
But you said in a focused way, but this doesn't sound very focused. So it's not talking about focus, is it?
You can focus on the 5.
Okay.
But that's not all. There's more clarity here.
Right.
So 3 strategic objectives, 5 tasks. There are 5 domains, and the good news now is it's not service focused or in fact even domain focused, but there are 5 domains. So there's maritime, land, air, and space and cyber, 5 domains.
Yep.
Now the 5 domains will be used to produce 6 capability effects.
Okay, 5 becomes 6.
That's right, across 3 epochs.
3 epochs?
Yes.
But the 3 epochs... And again, correct me if I'm wrong, epochs refer to geological time, don't they? So this is the pace we're meant to be working at. So the 3 epochs of geological time.
Well, the epochs are being pursued in an accelerated fashion.
Okay, accelerated geological time.
There are 3 epochs, but there are also 6 immediate priorities for Australia's force structure.
Hang on, so 3, 5, 6, 3, 6.
Yes, and the top one of those is AUKUS nuclear submarines, obviously.
Oh, of course.
And guided weapons is another. But before you focus too much on those 6 immediate capability priorities, which of course are in the first of the 3 epochs, I draw your attention to the 11 other capability priorities that are to be pursued over this epoch and the second epoch.
So hang on, there's 6 capability priorities or 11? Or there's 6 and 11?
There's 6 and 11. They're being pursued concurrently but independently in different epochs, if you see what I mean.
Different epochs, okay.
Yes.
So can I'm being reminded, many of us in our younger days, we sort of flirted with esoteric Eastern philosophies and theologies. And, there was a lot of stuff there
hang on.
the 4 paths to enlightenment, to escape the 7 planes of hell, and the 3 ways of self... It's sounding a bit like that, I have to say. So
I think you're forgetting the 12 paths to happiness across the 8 rocks of suffering.
Okay, yeah.
And this is just a reference back to my India trip.
I'm certainly being reminded reading this of the 8 rocks of suffering.
Yeah. But, okay, so that's the front end. 3 strategic objectives, 5 tasks, 5 domains, 6 capability effects across 3 epochs, with the epochs having 6 capability priorities in the first epoch, 11 in the second. Not sure how many in the third, but there will be more, because as time passes you can do more, obviously. But the other really interesting thing, and I think this is a new approach to policy making, is the additional number around reform. So we know reform is very, very important. We know defence has been pursuing.
And this is new and different because defence hasn't tried reform before.
Well, it has, but not in this way. Again, I think there's some very interesting focusing and clarification here.
So this is different reform?
Yes. Well, it's reform, and the reform agenda has 4 main reforms, and one of those reforms, which isn't said to be the most important, but I think might be, has 5 sub-reforms. So you see you have a reform agenda here that adds to the 3 objectives, the 5 tasks, the 5 domains, the 6 capability effects, the 3 epochs, the 6 immediate capability priorities, the 11 ones in the second epoch, and then a 9-stage reform agenda, which of course has 4 primary reforms and 5 supporting sub-reforms. That term sub-reform isn't used in the document, but I would expect to see it in a further elucidation of this strategy. And another reforms, what do we got? We've got strategy reform. We've got force, structure and capability reform. We've got capability acquisition and procurement reform. We've got force posture, preparedness and employment reform. And then we have enterprise reform, which is, of course, the one where you have the 5 sub-reforms. So there's the clarification and the simplification that this document has brought us.
That is very simple. Very simple.
But I think there are 2 other numbers, I think, that really lead us in to the analysis of the Integrated Investment Program.
Well, but before we get into the IIP itself, this supporting document with the shopping list to allow this very elegant strategy to be achieved, I have in the back of my mind hearing that we were moving from this sort of balanced force, very intellectually sloppy, this balanced force, to a focused force.
Yes.
So that's still in there. So
we've
got the focus force in there.
Across the 5 domains.
Yes. And I seem to recall saying that we were moving away from a balanced force because we don't want the ADF to be able to do a range of things. We want it to focus on one big thing. Is that correct? If
you ask it to do too much in too broad a way, you end up being able to do nothing.
So we want to focus on one big thing.
Yes.
Of a strategy of denial.
Yep.
But you just said there's like 5 tasks, and those 5 tasks go from the traditional narrow defence of Australia to doing stuff around the Indo-Pacific and the globe, effectively.
Are you seeing these things as somehow intellectually incoherent?
Well, that's your term, but yes.
Well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
well, you just did.
Isn't there a quote in the document that clarifies this? Didn't you dig out a quote where it lists the 5 tasks that go from local defence to global, and then it says, underneath it says, well, it's very important you focus.
Yes, well, I don't have that exact word with me, but I did notice that these 2 quite, I would say, contradictory concepts are in very physical juxtaposition in the document, which I find a little intellectually jarring.
Let me give you my impression of the overall document, apart from the intellectual bankruptcy of all of these numbers that are supposed to simplify things and instead make the whole thing impenetrable and silly. My overall impression is it's more of the same out of defence. As someone who was closely involved in the production of white papers, there's not a lot new here besides some wordification, and unfortunately it fails the test of clarity about what the ADF is going to do, and it fails the test of responding to what the document says is a rapidly deteriorating security environment. And we get the same old plan from Defence where nothing happens for at least a decade, except for one thing. So I said 2 numbers. There's not 10 years warning time. Defence has known that now for over 4 years.
Well, yes, we were told that by the DSU, the Defence Strategic Update, from the previous government 4 years ago. And again, this is one of those really jarring things. There's all this language here about this is new and different, and we've suddenly had this great realisation. It's essentially verbatim repeating what was said 4 years ago.
So there's no new military power in the immediate term. So instead of additional military power, the thing that Defence is going to do rapidly and more of is produce words. So this National Defence Strategy, which is now 2 years into the Albanese government's term, is going to be updated with a new version of it every 2 years. So while Defence can't produce any military power in under 10 years that changes our level of security in our unsafe strategic environment, we will ensure our security through producing more strategy documents. I think it is a wholly bankrupt, failing approach.
Well, I mean, I read this, I still don't know what the ADF actually has to do.
No.
So at the high level, we've got this strategy of denial. Well, what is strategy of denial? Essentially could be anything. And in fact, there's a little text box saying, well, it's actually working with the US and allies so that no country attempts to achieve its regional objectives through military action. Well, I mean, that's about the most general concept you can think of. But that seems to be about out there a bit, broader region.
That would be shaping, Marcus, which of course is a priority, but not the main priority.
But then this also means we have the ability to hold potential adversary forces at risk if they're trying to coerce Australia through force. So again, it's like, well, it's out there and it's here. It's these vague platitudes about being able to do everything. So then if you're trying to understand how does this translate into the force that we're going to be spending $330 billion on in the next decade, there is no golden thread of logic to actually say how you translate these high-level platitudes into an actual force structure with a coherent force.
Well, and that brings us to the other document that was released at the same time, the updated Integrated Investment Program. Now, Minister Marles, when he launched these things...
Deputy Prime Minister Michael.
Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Marles, when he launched these two documents, said that they were integrated and that this was a complete rebuild of Defence's investment program. They're not integrated. This is not a complete rebuild. This is putting an extra set of moustaches on the dolls that Defence already had. It's very recognisable as the old plan with a few tweaks. But one big thing not in it is missile defence.
So let me read you another one of those really jarring lines in here. So it says... in paragraph 1.26, geography cannot protect Australia against new long-range missiles. Now, I'd argue they're not particularly new long-range missiles, but it cannot protect Australia against new long-range missiles. So what is one of the big muscle movements in the Integrated Investment Plan? Ballistic missile defence seems to have gone completely, and a large funding line for medium-range ground-based air defence has also gone.
So billions of dollars in missile defence have gone.
Yeah.
At the same time as we heard that Australia had joined with the US and Japan on an Indo-Pacific missile defence architecture. So we're getting the architect in, but we have no plans to actually buy the building.
So we're still getting the air battle management system at a very large cost. I do seem to recall one of the few statements the DSR made around actual capabilities and projects is they said, your plans for an air battle management system are too ambitious and esoteric. You need to aim for minimum viable capability as soon as possible. Yet we're spending, I haven't got the number in front of me, I think off the top of my head it's like $9 billion or something on an air battle management system. And to get the battle management system, we seem to have given up the things that actually shoot.
That's right, which is back to, we'll have an architecture, and the architecture will be interchangeable and interoperable with the Japanese and the US. But unlike the Japanese and the Americans, we won't have any actual missiles to do missile defense.
The only thing I think we will have that has any ability to shoot an incoming long-range ballistic missile are our three air warfare destroyers.
Yes. So, one thing that struck me is the document, like Richard Marles, talks a lot about impactful projection. We need to hold the adversary at risk, and we'll do that with long-range strike, and that's why we're doing the guided weapons enterprise. But without missile defence, Australia is more likely to be subject to impactful reception, particularly if we were to conduct
good one, Michael. I like
impactful projection.
Well,
then we will receive incoming, and there's nothing to defend ourselves.
We've acknowledged that geography won't protect us against these missiles, so we're giving up any ambition of having military capability that could protect us.
I think that is a wholly budget-driven decision because it does not fit even with the strange logic in this national defence strategy. So I think the cuts to ground-based air defence and missile defence are wholly budget-driven.
The ballistic missile line in the force structure plan that came out with the DSU in 2020 was a very large line. It was about $20 billion. So if you're looking for some big fat target to save $20 billion, there you go.
Well, we're right now in the middle of your analysis of the Integrated Investment Program. So we've put a piece out that you wrote, and it has 10 big takeaways. Why don't you take us through those? Because I think they will show the emptiness of this new strategy and the fact that it's really a budget-driven force that we have, and the budget is dominated increasingly already by nuclear submarines and the Hunter frigates.
Look, I think the one key thing to take away from looking at the dollars is that even though we're not getting the first submarine, if all goes well in the optimal pathway, so-called, we get the first submarine 2032. Now, I think you would have to be rather optimistic to think that's going to happen on that schedule, but if we do, it's out there, but it is already distorting the budget. So I quipped in a previous piece on SAA that you can either have SSNs or you can have a Navy. I was wrong. What is actually happening is we are ring-fencing the Navy and increasing the investment in the Navy, and it's everyone else in defence that's taking it in the neck. So I think if listeners out there just want to sort of have one way to understand what's going on, there is a pie chart in the IIP itself on page 11 that breaks up the spending by domain. And there's more than 5, by the way, so I'm a bit confused from your previous.
Well, they might be capability areas. I'm not sure. They could be the 6 and the 11.
Well, anyway,
so the pie chart tells the story.
Breaks it down. Now, the maritime domain is now at 38% of Defence's investment.
Of the acquisition budget.
Of the acquisition budget.
Of the acquisition budget.
So the IIP, according to what was put out, is there's going to be $330 billion in spending on capability over the next decade. And you go, well, that's a pretty hefty chunk of money. 38% of that is maritime spending. The last time we saw something like this was the 2020 plan, and maritime spending was only 28. So it's gone up by 10, and in the previous one, in 2016, it was 24. So maritime is sort of expanding exponentially. Meanwhile, the other domains are shrinking. So air is actually now down from 24% down to a measly 14%. Land is at 16%. So you add the two other sort of traditional domains together, and you're at 30%. So you can add in there on top of that cyber for another 7%. You are still less than maritime. You know what
that tells me, just with those numbers, is we are storing up a growing problem with air capability and land capability. So this is a time bomb for future governments, because you cannot gut the spend on those capability areas without consequences. The Air Force recapitalised its entire fleet over the last couple of decades, but it's all going to age out. And this plan seems to me to not deal with that problem.
Well, so the government did circulate a sheet of cuts or changes to journos, and that sheet has found its way into our hands. I don't know why they don't include that in the IIP itself for the public to see, but anyway. Yes, and there is a lot of the traditional approach to the way Defence handles budget cuts, which is just to move things into the future.
Right, the sort of spreading, peanut buttering and rephasing out into the never.
Pushing it into the future. So a number of air capabilities have been pushed into the future, but we saw it was pretty clear from the DSR that Air Force wasn't going to get its long-desired 4th Squadron of F-35s. Now, okay, you can argue for and against, but I do find it rather strange that we've got this strategy of denial, of imposing cost. Well, if you want to do that, I would have thought that air power is a reasonable way of being able to do that. Plus, like them or not, F-35s actually exist. There is a functioning production line. We know how to use F-35s. We have a training system and a support system. Yep. And so you could get some more of them. But
and they can fire long-range missiles from them too, so that it's not their own range.
So that's gone as an option, but with no explanation. And so to get back to my previous point of we have this very, very high-level strategy, but no golden thread of logic sort of stepping through the operational use of the ADF, like what we think it's actually going to be doing and how, to explain the shopping list. So people like us can go, this doesn't make any sense.
Well, I don't care what scenarios they're using to try and make these investment decisions, and they've always used scenarios and they've always gamed the scenarios. But another thing that seems to undercut this whole design is the fact that even with the Navy, which is now going to eat the defence budget, it'd be interesting to hear, I think you've got to compare it with the US Navy, but even with the Navy, at the same time as the government saying they're doubling the size of the fleet, and that's not actually true because they're smaller, different vessels, they have gutted the ability to sustain and replenish the fleet when it's at sea. There were 2 support vessels that were in the old plan from the previous government. They're cancelled. So this new fleet will be less well supported than the smaller fleet that we planned beforehand. So again, where's this impactful projection if you can't support and replenish your ships when they're out doing what they need to do?
Yeah, I think that's one of the really striking cuts, particularly since the Service Fleet Review said there's 2 main tasks for the service fleet. One is protecting sea lanes of communication. And as we've learned, our sea lanes of communication extend all around the way around the world. So you think, well, you probably need long range, so some replenishment ships might be useful. And also they need to be able to protect our northern approaches, which would imply survivability, lots of weapons, and
maybe working with an air force providing air cover. I don't know. I'm just putting that out there.
If you're buying small ships that don't have a lot of missile cells, they're not going to last very long without air cover. So again, another one of those sort of, what's the concept that this force is meant to be supporting?
I think it is a budget-driven thing where the big fact is the money's getting eaten by the nuclear submarines and the frigates, and everything else has to make do. Yeah, that's what's going on.
When you sort of unpack that 38% number, it gets, I think, even more sort of scary and depressing, because of that 38% maritime spending, 2/3 of that, so about $90 billion, goes on 2 programs over the decade. No surprises, SSNs and the Hunter-class frigate. So it's 2/3 of the 38% maritime, which essentially means 25% of the total acquisition budget is going on those 2 programs. But those 2 programs don't deliver any real-world capability, best case, until right at the end of the decade.
Well, it's beyond that, isn't it? Because one nuclear submarine does not a capability make,
Correct.
One Hunter frigate does not a capability make. So It's a long time before you get any real capability from either.
A quarter of our acquisition budget over the decade period, we have no warning time. The NDS says worsening strategic circumstances, gotten even worse in merely 1 year from the DSR. Quarter of our acquisition budget gives us nothing.
So if I just wanted a rough comparator, and it's always dangerous to compare ourselves with the US, but if Australia is planning to spend 38% of its acquisition budget on the Navy, what's that, about 13% of the total defence budget on the Navy?
Yeah, so by my back of the beer coaster calculation, we'll be spending 13% of the total defence budget on shipbuilding. Right. Not maritime capability in general, actual shipbuilding.
So the US Navy is a big Navy. In fact, it's
less than
the
4%.
Second biggest.
Less than 4%.
They spend less than 4% of the total US defence budget on shipbuilding.
Yep.
And we're planning to spend 13% of our defence budget.
Yeah. So I think that's another way of illustrating the extent to which shipbuilding is distorting everything.
Yeah. Now, for this plan, this integrated investment plan, to make any sense, it has to be deliverable. One of the things I think you've drawn out is the wholly aspirational idea that defence is going to keep increasing its spend on acquisition. So it's eventually going to be 42% of the total defence budget is going to go on acquisition. And defence has made these claims before.
Tell them they're dreaming, Michael. So, defence has had these big ambitions, and governments have had these big ambitions of spending a lot of money to get a bigger, stronger, more robust defence force. And, but that also means you're increasing. So there's 3 big sort of pots of money in any organisation, and it's people, buying stuff,
acquisition,
and your operating costs. And in defence, that's mainly sustainment of capability. Traditionally, people has been the biggest one, and acquisition has been the smallest. It's sort of been in the mid-20s. But since the previous government came into power, they boosted acquisition spending and sort of got it up to the high 20s, around 30%. Then they did their big 2016 white paper and said, we're going to really increase the ADF, and we're going to get up to 39% acquisition spending. So that was in 2016. So that's
8 years ago.
8 years ago.
Where are we?
We've never gotten past 31%.
But we were meant to get to 39%.
Yeah, we've never gotten past 30. We've sort of plateaued at 30. And you go, well, why? I'm not saying there is this sort of iron law of physics that says you can't get past that. But then when you go, well, you buy stuff to use it, so you've got to pay operating and sustainment costs, and you need people to do that. So if you're spending more on acquisition, those other things are coming up as well.
Well, there's a nasty interrelationship, isn't there? In fact, defence's workforce costs are going up as the number of people have gone down.
Well, this is the interesting thing, is since the 2016 white paper, the ADF workforce hasn't gone up, but its workforce spending in real terms, so inflation-adjusted terms, I think off the top of my head, it's in the piece up on SAO, I think it's gone up by about sort of 15+% in real terms. So its workforce costs are increasing dramatically in real terms, even though numbers
And if it actually starts to get the numbers into the ADF that it needs, those costs are going to go up even more. So I just think it's magical thinking to think you're going to get 42% of the defence budget on acquisition, partly because Defence has no track record of being able to grow the acquisition anywhere near that. And then the other one, if it starts to achieve that, it needs the workforce. The workforce is getting more expensive while it's shrinking.
Well, the NDS doesn't solve the workforce problem other than by saying, well, we'll do some bonuses and some retention strategies like that. Oh, that's more money to spend.
Yeah.
But I'll just go back to the 42% thing, partly because 42 is the meaning of life. So we didn't make any real progress on the 2016 White Paper's aim. So in the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, guess what the number was there? We went from 39 to 40. So we increased the number.
Well, the aspirational number.
The aspirational number. We still haven't gotten there. So what have we done in the 2024 plan? We've increased it even further to 42%.
You've got a line in your piece, which is, how is it a Secretary of the Department of Defence can keep offering up unimplementable plans to government and getting them endorsed? This is just, it's not just a repeat of a failure. It's doubling down and saying, I'm going to have an even bigger target, even though I haven't been able to reach these smaller targets.
Now, so when we talk 42%, they're relative numbers. What does that actually mean in absolute numbers? Well, I've gone back to the plan that was put out in 2016 of acquisition spending, compared it to what we've actually managed to get out the door. Defence has missed its acquisition spend by a cumulative $22.5 billion.
Even in the world of nuclear submarines, that's real money.
So,
what that actually means is a bunch of things that the military were meant to get haven't happened. That money's been left on the table.
Well, not a lot of money has sort of gone unspent. It's just...
It hasn't gone on those things.
It hasn't gone on those things. It's been sucked up by sustainment spending, which is always more than defence plans, and it's gone on people. Now, so looking forward at that $330 billion spend, you go, well, they're probably not going to spend it all on capability, but they'll probably try and prioritise the most important things, which, guess what? SSNs, Hunter-class frigates, assuming those programs can actually get up to speed. So if they protect them, it's the other stuff which is going to take it in the neck. And so we've already seen out of the DSR, a bunch of programs have been cut. So infantry fighting vehicles, again, we can argue about whether that was a good decision or not, but other domains are suffering.
Maritime mine countermeasures and hydrography. You've mentioned the 4th Squadron of F-35s. We've talked about the cancellation of the 2 support ships to help the Navy be replenished at sea. Talked about removal of ballistic missile defence, removal of medium-range ground-based air defence. To me, the focus force is coming about through cuts that are budget-driven. It's not strategy-driven.
I don't think it's strategy driven. Yeah. So, well, it gets back to that point. If the whole strategy is strategy of denial, why is it that we're putting all of this money into platforms that are really, really expensive and ineffective ways of delivering high explosive that are very vulnerable? I mean, small warships, theoretically, you can come up with mosaic operational concepts, but there's been no discussion of how we're going to use those small warships in the Service Fleet Review or in the NDS or in the IIP. They're basically, you're spending a lot of money to get ships that don't have a lot of missile cells. You are not actually getting a lot of offensive capability to implement your strategy of denial.
No. You know what I predict is going to actually happen here? What is going to happen is acquisition is going to continue to bump along. It's not going to reach 42%, but more and more money is going to be sucked into the submarines and the frigates, both the Hunter and the general purpose frigate. That's going to mean a reduction in investments across the other services and capability areas. At the same time, because of delays in acquisition, sustainment costs are going to have to rise because keeping older stuff in service for longer gets more expensive. We've been seeing that with the Anzac frigate.
Or you say we're not going to keep them in
or
service.
You retire them and you have less capability. And then the third thing that is going to happen is the costs of the workforce are going to keep increasing as Defence's failure to recruit and retain people continues, and they just keep throwing more money at the problem. So the personnel budget's going to rise, the sustainment budget's going to rise, and the acquisition is going to be eaten by submarines and frigates, but not get to 42%.
I would agree with that prediction. And I'll just chuck in 2 more numbers. You triggered me on one. So, yes, the government has announced that we're going to retire 2 of the Anzacs. So one's going sort of in a matter of days, another one's going in 2 years. That'll get us down to 9 major service combatants, which is, I understand, the lowest we have ever been. The lowest we have ever been. So things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. They're not going to get better until the first general purpose frigates arrive. And I think I would not put any money on the first one arriving by 2029, which is the government's date. One more number. And it's a number that is not in there. And that is the number of submariners we're going to need to operate the SSN fleet. Now, even though the government has said, 20,000 people, 20,000 jobs in the SSN enterprise, as far as I'm aware, and if any of our listeners know that the number, if the government has put it out there and I've missed it, how many submariners we're going to need to operate the SSN force, as far as I can tell, they have steadfastly avoided releasing that number. I would love to know what it is. Currently, we have 750, 800-ish. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking we're going to need at least 3,000.
Yeah, and that's another unclimbable mountain. Marcus, thanks very much. For those listeners who've had the patience to get this far through the recording, thank you. We'll bring you another Grumpy Strategist episode when we're less grumpy.
Hopefully not, we won't have to wait another 3 weeks.
No. Thanks, Marcus.